we'll be thinking about ideas for quite a while on that. But we wanted to think about, what are some of the ways that we can really integrate and address our PBIS efforts into a whole variety of improvement plans. There are, voluntary ones, there are required ones, there are a range of them that are out there. But as it's a strategy that we are really banking on, that framework of being in place over time and adding elements to strengthen it as well, what is the role of really integrating those into the plans that we're kind of developing and thinking strategically across numerous years, kind of in the future, to kind of bank on that. So this will be the interactive start of the presentation. I've got a couple questions to ask, and I want you to kind of participate and include items into the chat. And then we will go on and I'll introduce our co-presenters that will give us a couple of different examples. This is certainly not exhaustive, but we wanted to give a couple of ways that those things can be addressed and fit within various voluntary and required plans. So again, as we get started, first question for our participants is, how many of you have written PBIS as a strategy into various improvement plans, school improvement plan, a district strategic plan, world's best workforce, etc. So how many of you, just do a hands up or a reaction button if you can find that, thumbs up if you want to. But how many of you have written that in as a strategy into the various plans that you're required to write or submit? Oh, we got a thumbs up from Walt Madden. That's great. Cambridge Isanti is a yes. That's awesome. Thanks, Tammy. Got other people that are still thinking about it, and that's great. We'll have more discussion items in the future. Again, I'll encourage you to keep writing in, because it's just nice to know when we get to those points of intersection, kind of how we can talk about that. So the second question, there's the follow-up that will help us focus is, which practices, PBIS general, PBIS tier 1, strengthening tier 2, or adding practices within that, what are the ways, or which are the practices, or what are the ways in which PBIS is referenced within work or strategic planning and improvement planning that you've done? So just a couple of examples. Again, I'd encourage you just to drop them into the chat, and we'll kind of circle back to talk about those a bit as we get into it. So what are the ways in which PBIS is referenced in those plans for those of you that do that? Oh, thanks, Casey. And I think that's Burnsville, Egan Savage. Tier 1 school-wide climate and culture. Excellent. For tier 1, and then check in, check out in tier 2. Fantastic, those are great examples. We'll get back to those in just a bit. All right, what we hope to do in this time, and again, I want to leave it flexible and open for ways that we do this, but I think the general goal is we'll give you a couple different perspectives. We have a couple people with us that will be able to show different examples of this, both what the plans are to do and how there might be some fits in that way. So really lucky to have Amanda Brett from Forest Lake High School in to share an example from Forest Lake in terms of school improvement. We have Dan Torres, who will share some information about ADSIS, which is a program in place in, well, he'll tell you more about the scale of that, but doing academic and behavioral prevention programs, very targeted in a way that has a natural relationship with PBIS. And then Aaron Barnes is going to talk about CEIS, which is very specific to special education for districts that are cited for either disproportionality in identification or in discipline, and a new option within that realm to demonstrate kind of reasonable progress on the strategies and goals. So we're kind of excited about this. Please give us feedback if there are other examples that you'd like to see in the future. We can see kind of building this out into an improvement-based kind of webinar. I think it's always helpful to have specific district examples within that too, and school examples. So if you're interested and have something to share with us, please be in contact. We'd love to keep kind of building off of this. All right, next slide. Again, I covered a little bit the examples that we will share. We're going to do CEIS first. I'll talk a little bit about the PBIS application and how we include some elements of that in there. And we'll also talk a little bit about school-linked mental health and some of the grant kind of possibilities and requirements that way towards the end. So hopefully you can see kind of a sampling across a range of different kinds of programs. And again, at any point, if you have an example that's not on the list that you want to share, or discussion items or question to ask, I'd like this to be kind of flexible and interactive. Next slide. So as those of you that applied, for some of you, it's been a number of years, but when you think about the PBIS application itself, one of the roles that it plays is really guiding the applicants through the exploration activities in terms of team formation, getting a data system in place. There are prerequisites in that as well, which really place the readiness for PBIS installation and the commitment to collect data and analysis. So again, already laying out, we can see that teams benefit when they have these things organized, kind of explored and addressed as they arrive at training and come to training, and we've seen the great benefits of that over the years. Next slide. For our cohort 16, I thought one of the questions we didn't ask in the beginning, but we have been asking in recent years, is what % of schools are implementing other kind of related or aligned initiatives? And as you can see from this list, again, we kind of have a wide range when we were looking at up to 60 or schools that were in that cohort. Almost all of them were addressing social emotional learning. Most of them had some services or supports in place for school-linked mental health. The coordination with ANSYS on the academic side, 36. The behavior side was only 17, which was interesting. And so you can see the connection and relationship of these two, even within ANSYS, where schools and districts have discretion about that. But other common ones you see are responsive classroom, restorative practices, culturally responsive education, check-in, check-out, check-in, connect, and envoy. And I think, as you're putting that framework in place, I think back to what Tamika LaSalle was talking about yesterday in terms of the framework to really help organize the practices. And there's great discretion on kind of what to call it or how to do that. But what you don't want to do is have like silos of different programs happening differently that are often layering on, interventions, supports, or practices to different kids, yet creating gaps in between and sometimes duplicating. So the framework really has the opportunity to help organize that. And you can see from these schools that were entering training for cohort 16 just how common that experience is. Next slide. So I want to start with an example from Coordinated Early Intervening Services. I know Aaron Barnes is with us, and I was scanning the participant list to see if Alex could join us today, but Aaron, why don't you hop on?
Yeah, all right. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Great.
Yep.
Great. So like Eric was saying, I'm going to talk a little bit about CEIS. And if you've, Tamara, you can go ahead to the next slide. If you're not familiar with CEIS, well then just bless you and hang on. This is a very high level overview of what CEIS is, but I want to talk more about how we can really connect some nice dots and find some good alignment between CEIS plans, demonstrating reasonable progress towards reducing disproportionality in special education, and PBIS. So at a really high level, CEIS comes to us from the federal government. It's a federal level program. And it says in the state of Minnesota, we are going to identify districts where students in special education are experiencing disproportionate outcomes based on race and ethnicity. And the way that's set up is if students with disabilities are either being identified at significantly higher rates, students in a particular group are being identified for special education at particularly higher rates, if they're being placed in more restrictive settings at particularly higher rates, or if they're being disciplined at disproportionate rates compared to other racial or ethnic groups, then that district can be identified as having significant disproportionality. And the risk ratio, the cutoff in Minnesota is 3.0. So if students in a particular group are, for example, being disciplined with exclusion, they're experiencing exclusionary discipline outcomes 3 times or more than students in other racial or ethnic groups, then that district could be identified for significant disproportionality. And those kind of numbers have to show up for 3 consecutive years before it becomes kind of a mandatory intervention. And then that district is putting together a CEIS plan. So that's really high level of what we're talking about here. But there are some I think promising avenues for how districts can take steps to move forward and start reducing those levels of disproportionality. So, all right, next slide. I think we're going to move to the next slide. I had a spinny wheel on my computer, but it looks like it's working all right. There we go. So I'm going to move through these slides really quickly. This is just an overview of the different categories for identification. So if groups are being identified for special education at different rates, you can see this is kind of a broad pass at some of our higher incidence disabilities. Next slide. Here's one that's a little bit more relevant and aligned to our PBIS Summer Institute. So here are the different categories or ways that districts could be identified for disproportionate rates of discipline. You can see a focus on in-school and out-of-school suspensions, but also total disciplinary removals. Next slide. And then this one is really fast. This is also just instructional setting. So students that are are placed in instructional settings in special education at federal setting 3 or above. That's another way that those things could be identified. Next slide. All right. So the basic idea is when a district is identified for in one of those for one of those categories. So students from a particular racial or ethnic group are experiencing that outcome at 3 times or more than their counterparts for 3 or more years in a row, then they're going to have to put together a plan for how they're going to address that. There's also a mandatory set aside of federal special education dollars so that they use to enact that plan. But what that looks like is, so say, for example, students in a particular group or in a particular district are, experiencing disciplinary incidents at 4 times the rate of their peers in other groups for 3 years in a row. Well, that district is going to have a plan, but we have created some options in Minnesota so that if the district is making progress towards getting below that 3.0 threshold, there are ways that they can demonstrate that and then basically receive more flexibility in whether or not they're setting aside those funds. as long as they can continue to demonstrate that progress. Or if you look down at option number 4 on this slide, if they can demonstrate the scaling up the use of well-matched, well-aligned evidence-based practices to try and respond to the disproportionality that's been identified. So these are our options for discipline. Go ahead, next slide. So the place where we start to connect the dots here is that, especially if a district has been identified for discipline, we want them to be able to find good, well-aligned practices that are targeted to that group of students that's experiencing disproportionate rates of discipline. But we know that there are districts that have good foundations of PBIS in place. Maybe not all students are experiencing the benefits of that in the same way. There could be tweaks or adjustments that could be maintained, but we are hoping and we are working to find more opportunities where there can be alignment between districts who are looking to make progress in their CEIS plans and districts that are already doing or interested in doing more through a PBIS lens. So this slide is a reference to the 5-point intervention plan that we see from the National Center, the National TA Center for PBIS. If you're not familiar with that, it's well worth checking out. And at the most high level, this is really just showing 5 broad areas that have been identified that can be used to help address discipline disproportionality. And so if I was just talking with a district that maybe had been identified for discipline disproportionality, this is a great place they could go and look for what might be some evidence-based practices or some things we could put into our plan to get started. How many of these things are we doing? How many of these things are brand new to us? It's a good place to look. And we'll be able to walk through an example here in a second. Next slide. All right. This slide is really just to make the point that when a district identifies what these things are, it needs to be aligned. That is, if students are experiencing too much out of school suspension and the group is, say, for example, Hispanic, Latina students, then you need to be able to demonstrate in your plan that those things are showing up, right? It can't just be talking about PBIS universally. You have to be able to demonstrate how it's going to impact that group of students. That's why we're big on alignment. Next slide. So in order to demonstrate reasonable progress of scaling up an evidence-based practice, right, of which good culturally responsive PBIS practices could be a fit, you would need to show effort, fidelity, and outcome data for how those things are being put into place. Next slide. So you need to identify the practice and really clearly say what the critical features of that practice are. Match it to that target group and disability category, like I said on the previous slide, alignment, and include your data for the 2 consecutive years prior to this year. So we like to deal in 3 consecutive years in CEIS. Next slide. So here's an example. If Hispanic students with disabilities had been experiencing disproportionate rates of discipline, a district could come to us and say, we want to implement some culturally responsive PBIS practices to help and reduce that disproportionality. They can make that case. These are resources that are available to them. We've put this out as a hypothetical example, and you'll see some of the years that we put this together a couple of years ago. Next slide. This is the example that I'm going to walk through now. So here's an example of what effort data might look like. For a district, over the course of 3 or more years, you could increase and build up the number of buildings in your district that have been trained in culturally responsive PBIS practices. Again, being able to show, demonstrate, and discuss that it is aligned to that group of Hispanic students with disabilities. So this is one example of effort data that you would need to demonstrate. Next slide. Here's an example of fidelity data. This is another reason why we like to try and connect these dots between PBIS and reasonable progress, is because we know that there are tools for fidelity of implementation that already exist. It's not something that people need to stretch for or create their own fidelity measure or figure out how to do it. There are good tools, excuse me, like the tiered fidelity inventory that already exist. So they can identify what the critical features of PBIS are. If they have a good foundation in place, those should be readily available. And you see these bullets here on this slide should be really familiar to anyone who's working through and built out a foundation of PBIS practices. Next slide. And then, like I just mentioned about the TFI. So not only do we have the TFI, but there are things like the Cultural Responsiveness Companion that allows you to look at those same critical features of PBIS through the lens of cultural responsiveness and rate those things as well in the same way that you would go through the TFI. Next slide. And so again, here's our hypothetical example that just shows the number of schools that were measured at fidelity on the TFI could be increasing over time. Again, it's in this example to show scaling up of reasonable progress for CEIS. It would be through that, it would include that cultural responsiveness companion to the TFI. And you would be able to show, demonstrate, and describe how this is impacting those Hispanic students with disabilities. Next slide. So I won't read through all of this, but this is really just a blurb. So right, this is literally from our paperwork for demonstrating reasonable progress. We ask them to explain, how has this tool measuring the fidelity? And again, if you're going through PBIS practices and you're using the TFI, it's a pretty easy thing to describe. It's a really good fit for being able to demonstrate fidelity over time. So this is just some example text of what that can look like. Next slide. All right, so here's our last bit. Again, there's going to be many other pieces of outcome data, but this is just an idea again. So targeting that specific group, if a district could demonstrate that over these 3 years, 3 or more years, the number of disciplinary incidents for that group of interest, Hispanic students with disabilities, is decreasing. That's kind of the last piece of what we're looking for, what we'd be looking for between that effort, fidelity, and outcome data. So again, we know there's lots of different ways that we could measure it, but this idea of overall absolute measures of total disciplinary incidents for that group decreasing is an example of the kind of data that would be helpful for a district to demonstrate reasonable progress as part of their CEIS plan. Yeah, go ahead, tomorrow. So that's a really fast and high level overview of that. Thanks for sticking with me on that. And I really hope that there's some ideas or light bulbs going off because again, people who are already well versed or are prepared to build a foundation of PBIS in their district are some of our best, most prepared people to try to make a reasonable progress, demonstrate reasonable progress and scaling up evidence-based practices in CEIS.
Yeah, thanks, Aaron. And if people have questions or follow-up ideas and feedback, please feel free to put them in the chat or connect with us directly too at the email addresses that are there. I like to lead with this one because this is an example where we learned what progress looked like by partnering with schools and districts in PBIS. And that process from training to building that capacity in one school across several schools, scaling it up, doing it well over time, we could see that pathway that led to improved student results that sometimes took more than a year or two to get there. And what I liked is that demonstration of capacity, staff that are trained, staff that are implementing, staff that are now implementing well, taking it to scale across the district is really an improvement strategy that you want to see in place with evidence-based practices that's really replicable across all the other things that we'll talk about as well. So I appreciate the walkthrough with that, the connection to the PBIS specific resources. And I just wanted to put a nod out to the learning that happens together, and that really effective practice has helped us create an option for reasonable progress, and that demonstration in this particular case. And we are the first of all 50 states and territories to take the feds up with an option to allow schools and districts to demonstrate that. So it's an important part of that really shared learning, and we encourage you to continue that. We think it's valuable and helps what you're learning at a local level and a district level and a regional level really does help influence and shape what's happening at the state level as well. So thank you, Erin. We'll move on to our second example. Next slide. And I want to introduce and welcome Amanda Brett to share the district strategic plan that they've been working on Forest Lake and how that relates to her work at Forest Lake Area High School. Welcome, Amanda.
Hi, everybody. I'm Amanda Brett. I am a teacher at Forest Lake High School, but I've been on our PBIS committee for since implementation, since we started 3 years ago, I believe. And so this example shows how we have included PBIS into our strategic plan for the district and how the high school is specifically doing it. And so like if you look at this quote here, it's our new district strategic plan that came out in 2020 has a goal that states create a safe, inclusive learning environment that fosters personal well-being. The objective of this goal is to develop and implement teaching practice throughout the district that ensures students develop healthy relationships and are able to attain social and emotional health. And this work in our district and at the high school level is guided by PBIS and CASEL's work as well. So next slide. And so just kind of the beginning parts of that. So next slide. So here what you're looking at is our strategic plan for the Forest Lake School District that was developed by a committee of various stakeholders and run through a process. And typically like every school. And so there are the 6 areas, and the one that PBIS really fits into is our excellence in fostering personal well-being in a safe and respectful environment. And the district has 10 goals that go to and foster our beliefs. And the goal is to create a safe, inclusive learning environment that fosters personal well-being. And so this is where our PBIS framework is falling under. Next slide. So at the beginning of this past year, we spent some time in our workshop week incorporating both teacher and student values into the classroom community. And then we worked on developing rituals and routines. And so this work, along with our culturally responsive teaching work and then also our social emotional work are the 3 things that are getting at this core part of the strategic plan. So then in October of this past year, we had a staff development training on CASEL's work where we connected it to social emotional learning into the classroom routine and worked on welcoming engagement and optimistic closure. Next slide. So during the workshop week, this is an example of one of the activities that we did. This is a Padlet that teachers were able to respond to in some of the areas. And so we looked at, first of all, our own personal values as staff so that we can get at our own cultural backgrounds and values of where we're coming from. And then do we shift that when we become an educator, or do they stay the same? What are those values that we seek in students? And that we want all students to adhere to and develop, and then how do these show up when we're building community amongst our students, especially at the very beginning of the year. This was a huge focus based on the fact of being in a distance learning model, being in a hybrid model, being back in a full in-person model, all of the models, but that building community is the one big focus. So what does that actually mean to you? So we changed, we talked about how PBIS has changed that culture. What do we do in our daily routines, examples, and what kind of space are we using to build community in our classroom, which eventually leads to our own classroom matrices that each teacher is required to have. Next slide. So then it kind of moved into October's professional development. And in the professional development, we have kind of a sequence of most of our professional development right now is based around culturally responsive teaching, SEL, and then also PBIS. And so in October, we combined the SEL practices with the PBIS discussion and talked about Castle's work and how we want to establish in all of our classrooms, in every single subject, every single class, every single day, that we have some type of welcoming ritual, some type of activity, inclusion, something that allows for students to connect with one another, and then also you and establishes that day. Then there's the engaging practices. What are you doing during the hour, during the class period? You know, what activities do you do to continue to foster that engagement, but also foster that culturally responsive piece? And then having an optimistic closure and thinking about the reflection for the day and leaving the day on a positive note. Next slide. So each teacher in this October PD worked through kind of a lesson planning kind of model, and how were they going to, you know, what were some welcoming rituals that they've done? What are some engaging strategies that they have done? And then also including what could be an optimistic closure. And we worked in departments based on this because it works differently for different departments at the high school level. Sometimes it might be something that, you know, an industrial tech department could do, but a math department is a little bit different. And so it seemed easier to kind of work on those responses and that SEL piece in different departments. Next slide. And then just really kind of the outcomes of it and why we continue to do it and why we build it in is that it's really been a good data-informed dialogue that we've been using, you know, looking at our failure data, looking at our PBIS data. We used a lot of different data this year because we didn't have a lot of behavior data at the beginning of the year. And for most of the year, just not being fully in person. And so it kind of challenged us to think about where is that student achievement coming from. And quarter one, we had a lot of failure data. And so thinking about kind of, are these kids feeling connected? Are they not? And then we, you know, have worked on building those key relationship strategies from PBIS, Castle, and culturally responsive teaching in the brain. And so we've been working on all of those and building them together so that staff feel that the PD is focused and useful. And then just building, you know, applying it to all the building strategies to build relationships and communicate with those disengaged students and families, and things that will continue into this next year. Next slide. So that would be all for us.
Yeah, thank you, Amanda. And I think this provides a nice opportunity too, just to think, you know, in a lot of places we've seen kind of school and district improvement plans, and sometimes it's hard to address things that really have been in place for a while. So it's nice to see in this example the way that, you know, it's really pulling all of these things together with what you have in place and how you're building that and making it stronger. I think doing some work with the regional centers of excellence supporting schools that have been identified for their support. They're often like forgetting to put some of these common things in place that have been around for a while. So this is a neat example that really is tying that all together. So thank you. Our next presenter will be Dan Torres talking about the ANSYS program. Take it away, Dan.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks everybody for being here. I'm really excited to share some information about ANSYS, Alternative Delivery of Specialized Instructional Services. See a lot of familiar names on the call. I'm going to do a high-level overview of what ANSYS is, make some connection points to how that fits within your PBIS work that you're doing, and then give a great example toward the end of a local example of how some of those initiatives are being aligned, those ANSYS work is being aligned within their PBIS. So next slide, please. So at the high level, ANSYS is a funding source to provide direct instruction services to K-12 pupils who need additional academic or behavioral support to succeed in the general education environment and may eventually qualify for special education or related services if the intervention services were not available. So it's a funding source that you can utilize at the district level to put those academic and behavioral interventions in prior to and in the plan of to prevent unnecessary qualifications for special ed. So this is really in line with PBIS and looking at that proactive and preventative intervention approach. Next slide. Maybe missing, or maybe there's a animation here. Can you click next? There we go. So really where that fits, you're all familiar with the triangle. What we're looking at is ADSIS serving that role of that tier 2 and tier 3 intervention services. On the right is that state statute language for PBIS that identifies having that continuum of interventions that are integrated and aligned with supports. So we're really looking at the funding source to provide that tier 2 and tier 3 intervention that's a part of your PBIS framework, that's a part of your MTSS framework at that district level. Next. The ADSIS framework, this should all be very familiar for you all, but really quickly going through the needs assessment, identifying those needs, creating some service goals around the interventions that you're going to implement, screening and assessment process, so having screening tools, progress monitoring tools in place. Step 4, the ADSIS service and intervention. So what is that evidence-based practice that you are going to implement? Step 5, the process for monitoring individual student progress. 6, process and criteria to determine exit and entrance and exit from ADSIS services. So how are we identifying those students? We're really relying on and leaning on that framework to be able to walk us through that process of what is it that you're using as a screening tool, how are you identifying those students, and then how are you getting those students that extra scoop that they need in that advanced tier. And then step 5, identifying the role of teachers, parents, guardians, parents and advocates, and the coordinators, and the other district staff. And step 8, plan for evaluating the ADSIS services, and then going back through that process of plan, do, study, act. Next slide. ADSIS services can be utilized in reading, math, and behavior. Here's our latest data that shows the breakout of the districts that are and how they're utilizing these funds. Districts can utilize ADSIS dollars to implement any 1, 2, or all 3 of these in any combination, whatever their needs are at that district level. And we see by the data that most districts are at least implementing reading. That tends to be an entry point, but we're seeing more and more districts that are adding more interventions in different areas, and behavior being that biggest growth area for us. As people are building out the framework, as people are getting more comfortable with their PBIS implementation, they're really looking at ways in which they can utilize these dollars to implement those evidence-based practices at that advanced tier stage. Next slide. ADSIS is within state statute. I'm not going to get into it, but there is a funding statute, and there is the programmatic side of the statute. Next slide. Just an overview of the growth of ADSIS. This is the funding and state expenditures. This is the funding over a 10-year span, as we see from, and I'm sorry, the numbers may be hard to read, but we looking at a growth of just over $10 million in the school year of 2009-2010 to over $70 million in 2019-2020. and that is continuing to increase too. We just closed, actually have the last deadline date for applications tomorrow, but we've continued to see growth of ADSYS funds and as districts taking advantage of that state funding opportunity. So this graph you see here will continue to show the same trend. Next slide. And here's the numbers of districts. As we see that growth of funding, more districts are taking advantage of this state aid. So 35 schools in 2005, 2006 to 192 schools in 2019, 2020. We currently have over 200 and continuing to see that growth within this next cycle. Next. And here's a breakdown of the map. So it is not just one specific school or type of school or region within the state. We're seeing ADSYS funds being used throughout the state, big, small, north, south, metro, big districts, small charters. There's a lot of different ways in which these dollars can be used at your local level. Next. And of course, as we see districts, more districts utilizing the services, we see the impact at that student level of servicing over 31,000 students. And that number continues to climb as well. Next slide, please. One of the highlights I wanted to point out with this slide as we look at the breakdown in demographics, as we continue the theme of the institutes here, is ways that we can leverage some of the dollars that we have access to really look at ways we can target equity and inclusion. And if we see the breakdown of how districts are utilizing these ADSYS dollars, we see that we're seeing some overrepresentation of student group within ADSYS that are having some lagged results and student groups that are maybe on the bottom of that opportunity gap. And we're seeing some underrepresentation at the top of this chart here within the white student group category. So this data in this chart is showing to us that districts are really looking at ways they can utilize this state dollars to get those students that extra scoop, that extra supports, and leverage those dollars in ways that they can target some maybe disproportionality, as Aaron was talking about, outside of the CEIS dollars, and how can they do that within the frameworks that are existing in their schools. Next slide, please. And the breakdown of where we're seeing these dollars being spent is early. So early at the elementary level, and we're seeing a lot of these dollars being spent. It kind of where we see a lot of the PBIS implementation, really highly, or more schools taking advantage of it at that early level. Next. And one of the examples that I wanted to highlight here, and I saw Tammy's name here and I saw her mark in the chat. I had a great conversation with Tammy earlier in the week, and she allowed me to share some examples of some great work that they're doing of how they're aligning their ADSYS funds within PBIS and at the school level, at the district level. And I really appreciate the opportunity, Tammy, that you afforded us to be able to share that story. So I'll just give a brief, some snippets of that great conversation I had with Tammy. Cambridge Isanti School District, we want to make sure to recognize them and the great work that they're doing at not only the school level, but at the district level of implementing PBIS. And they're being recognized as an exemplar during our summer institutes here. They've made that move to become a district-wide implementing PBIS, and they've worked alongside MDE to complete not one, but two of the district capacity assessments around PBIS to not only understand what they're doing well, but also understand where they can make some action plans around some things to improve. And this is a great way that districts can look at action planning and building out that full-scale PBIS throughout the district. So we want to recognize that that they really put in the hard work. It is not an easy task to do. It is something that we look at doing over a long period of time. And this is that iterative improvement stage, and we want to recognize them for doing that. They're dedicated to doing a yearly TFI. Data privacy efforts, I won't share scores, but there are some great scores in there. They are really doing well. They are improving. And I also want to point out that even if scores aren't great, the fact that you're doing them year over year over year proves that you're committed to the implementation. And any school district that is going to be doing that TFI year over year is going to end up finding areas to improve, which will increase that likelihood that they will improve. Cambridge Isanti is dedicated to district-wide PBIS training. Tammy shared with me an incredible story of their district spending a half day of all staff, that's teachers, administrators, paras, lunch staff, custodial staff, all within mixed groups, working on PBIS specific training on a whole half day on the back to school week. And the efforts are saying at the district level, everybody is involved. It's not just the teacher, it's not just the administrators, it's not just behavior staff. Everybody's involved in this PBIS effort. And Cambridge Isanti is really dedicating some of those most valuable resources of time to this training at that district level. And they're also leveraging multiple funding sources. Tammy also shared with me about them sending their Office of Indian Ed staff to check and connect training to be able to leverage that evidence-based practice, not only just for students within ADSIS or students within special ed, but students that identified need within the school, and then getting the staff the training that they need to be able to implement that evidence-based practice. Which leads me into the next highlights that I want to show on the next slide is how they're implementing those. They have that solid PBIS core. They're committed at that school and district level. And they're leveraging these ADSIS dollars to be able to service their students at that tier 2 and tier 3 level. One of the ways that they're doing that is they're implementing what they call REACH at the middle school level. And REACH stands for Relationships, Education, Accountability, Character, and Hard Work. And this is a scheduled class for students at the middle school level that they get credit for. They go through the screening and qualification process. They're identified as a need for ADSIS services. And these students are enrolled in this class during one of the trimesters. And they spend that time in a check-in, check-out, and a check-and-connect format, really teaching, modeling, reinforcing those desired behaviors. And Tammy said it's not just the job of the REACH teacher to be able to demonstrate these things, but they're getting that same message when they leave that REACH class, because all of the staff have been trained and all of the staff have been recognized to say, hey, we're all in this together to be able to define, teach, and model and reinforce those expected behaviors. And they're doing that and they're funding that teacher with ADSIS dollars. Another approach that they're doing is with their math recovery, and they're doing a similar thing where they're identifying students based on their screening criteria. And then if they've met that criteria, they will be enrolled in a math recovery during one of the trimesters following and then they can either be exited, and she shared some great data with me about the number of students that are exiting that math recovery as well as the REACH program and going back onto that regularly scheduled path. And I just wanted to make sure to acknowledge the hard work, acknowledge the incredible ways in which these dollars are being leveraged and utilized within that strong foundation of the PBIS framework, as well as their MTSS framework. So thank you for sharing those stories. I want to make sure to be cognizant of the time. You can reach me directly at my email here, or you can email our ADSYS team at mde.adsysreview@state.mn.us. Thank you for the time.
Yeah, thank you, Dan. Next slide, Tamara. And as we go, I mean, I think one of the things to think about is what are the cycles for these various things. And ADSYS is every 2-year, districts can rewrite and readjust kind of their plans and those sorts of things. Sometimes school improvement can run annually or multi-year. So it's really thinking through that sequence to how you can keep making those adjustments that allows the work to build forward. And, you know, again, kudos to Tammy and team for doing such a nice job integrating that. I wanted to cover just quickly, I know the numbers are real high across the state for numbers of sites that are both PBIS trained and also have access to school-linked mental health supports through community-based providers and others that are out there. So we wanted to share a couple things with you quickly, and I think we'll have a couple minutes for questions at the end. Next slide, please, Tamara. Again, we have a similar history in terms of like when things were started, but the state legislature put money into place for school-linked mental health grants. As we look about those numbers, again, it's up to 1,100 or so schools in Minnesota, which is just over half that have that support. When we looked at the list of schools, it was about 37% of those are PBIS buildings. So this is, again, a great natural opportunity, and both with ADSYS and the school-linked mental health grants. I think Minnesota is so lucky in a way that there is some fiscal support through both those programs to have some practices to put on the tier 2 and tier 3 shelves and coordinate in a way that, you know, my colleagues from other states don't have such things in their states. So I think we really are fortunate, and there's an opportunity to really align those for strategic purposes because there is a nice base of that kind of happening. Those core components of both of those are really enhance the partnerships between school-linked mental health and those host schools, supporting mental health for all students. And again, I like through all of this, you know, there is that commitment to prevention, which is often lost in that mix, but also a commitment to follow up with support and intervention as well. So it's kind of a neat combination. Next slide. There's some grantee duties that are listed on here, and we won't go into great detail with it today. The PowerPoint will be there and available to you. But, you know, really thinking about that coordination and strengthening those partnerships from providers who are coming into your school that really have the benefit of things like a behavioral matrix and others, to think about how can we partner together to really coordinate, not duplicate, and not have any gaps between the services and supports that we have. So some great natural opportunities and a common commitment to a range of evidence-based practices. So great chance for partnership in this way. Next slide. Again, there's so many natural and shared outcomes. This is a well-versed group, so we won't go greatly into detail, but we have them listed. Again, if you want to enter in the chat, if you have these, that sort of coordination available, that would be great. We know the likelihood with the group is it's about 50% or so for those implementing schools. So anyway, these common outcomes that we're working towards together. It was years really developing these with our partners at DHS and them giving the guidance to community partners and us working with schools to make sure everyone knew, you know, what they were bringing to the table and what our shared outcomes are. Next slide. There are some resources, including a webinar that's on our website about the interconnected systems framework in a way to really connect and integrate those practices from PBIS and with mental health. So if that is work that you're engaged in right now, this can be an effective support to you. We encourage you to check that out. Next slide. The blue slide. We have two district examples, and we referenced them. I referenced them yesterday in a presentation at PBIS, and we don't have time to go into great depth, but I think Jill from ASIO is on the call when we get to Q&A if there are some examples. But what I like is, again, here's an exemplar district with several schools that were recognized. The schools shared in the example, as well as in St. Paul, really help embed those examples of how they're aligning within their school improvement plans, with their district plan, multi-year plans and priorities, with their PBIS framework of how you kind of move forward that way. So there really are some nice examples at a district and a school level in the APBS recorded presentation. And maybe we can find that link to that and drop that in the chat in the meantime, but encourage you to check it out if you haven't seen it already. So why don't we skip through the ASIO and St. Paul slides for now. And next slide. That was the last one from St. Paul. Again, we covered this briefly this morning and Darren referenced it as well, but as things like local school and district funding through the American Rescue Plan come out, just encourage people to think really strategically with what you have, where you want to go, and how to strengthen those current systems. I think it's great advice. More expanded detail is available at that link and at the National PBIS Center's website. But I think that's the theme of this whole presentation, of thinking like, what are the natural opportunities to align strategically, where we've been, where we are, and where we're trying to go, to really cement that commitment to multi-year, planning and progress that helps, sustain that effort through challenging times, and especially through leadership changes and staff turnover and the kinds of things that really can impact implementation as well. So it's the speed version through lots of different things. I'm glad we have a really fluent group on this call with a number of different things. But at this point, I think we just kind of want to open it up to questions, comments, experiences that you have, either what's working well or what some of the challenges to align your PBIS work within various improvement planning processes. Any brave volunteers?
Hi, Eric. I can probably jump in. This is Jill from ASIO.
Well, hi, Jill, and thank you.
You're welcome. So I think the biggest thing from us, I think you recapped it really well. We start by linking all of our MTSS, PBIS work to our strategic mission and to the outcomes. And so when we have our monthly PBIS meetings, large group, we make sure that all PDS, each school does a PDSA, and that links back to their behavioral goal within their site improvement plans. And we have found a lot of success with that. So it really is strategic all the way from the mission, all the way down to the site plans, and also using the TFI data and the DCA information as well. So that's kind of what keeps us on track.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Jill. The other, in this specific example in ASIO, I know one of the things that you do well is really sharing data back around fidelity gains when schools are growing and strengthening in their fidelity of implementation, and also scaling gains as you're getting to more classrooms or more school buildings within the district. I think sometimes it's hard, in a district with more than 20 schools, You know, if you have it going well in 5 schools, people will be looking at district data and say, why isn't it changing? So to give that progress monitoring data, strengthening implementation and strengthening that scale, builds some of the patience to get to that place where sometimes people are looking for student outcome changes the day people come back from day 1 of cohort training. So I think, you know, you've done a really nice job in that district of sharing that fidelity gain and scaling gain data as feedback to people that you are making progress.
Yeah, and we also share that information with our school board. And then I think you were there. We always do the end of year celebration where
Yes.
all like 28 sites come together and do a quick presentation on their outcomes of their PDSAs. So they all learn from each other. So that's also a super cool thing that we do.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks a lot, Jill. I love those. It's kind of one of my highlights of the closing of the year every year. So love to see those examples. We had a couple of comments earlier. I don't know if they're still with us from Casey, Tammy, Walt, and Deb about kind of some coordination with some things in their district. So anyone have some questions, comments, or experiences they want to share?
I can go, Eric. This is Tammy from Cambridge
Thanks,
Isani.
Tammy. Yep.
In our conversation with Dan the other day, we were talking about different sources and all the different programs that are available to schools out there. And I said it's really hard to isolate one in itself because we really use all of our ADSES and our title funds and our PBIS and all of that. And it's really under one umbrella and everything is connected. And so we make it an effort that we include all of these programs under our big MTSS framework in our school improvement plans. We're district-wide committed. And so everything that we're doing, it all fits. It's like all pieces of a puzzle. And it's hard to think about these as separate entities because they work well with each other. We've dedicated Title IV funds every year as a district for our teams to be able to meet twice a year to look at that, to take the TFI in the spring. Building level teams take the TFI, and then in August, we pay for them to come in and meet again and then look at that TFI data and create action steps for the upcoming year. Really looking at the TFI data and that district capacity assessment data has helped us see where we need to improve. And a lot of it is looking at that data and really making action steps to get improvement. So it's not just taking those measures to check them off. It's actually to look at it and utilize that to move forward.
Yeah, thank you, Tammy. It's such a great example. And, you know, again, when you see that like graded approach under an MTSS umbrella, it looks so easy and natural. And, you know, it's amazing how many times we don't see that approach being taken. And what's being mentioned in various improvement plans or site plans are just like new things, not how they're building out, you know, and enhancing, you know, more robust systems of support. So that's a really heartening example. Thank you for sharing that. Okay, we'll do one last call for questions. Otherwise, I think we're going to close. Any last questions or comments from our participants or panelists? All right, well, if not, I thank you for your time. If you have comments, questions, suggestions, experiences that relate to this that you'd like to share or come to you later in the day, I would encourage you to send them to us. We are very interested in collecting this and helping infuse that in guidance across programs in support of coordinated improvement planning. So things aren't so siloed that way. We really appreciate your hard work and you know, hope that you are able to have some time to slow down just a bit and recharge batteries in the summer. But thanks for spending time with us at this institute. Appreciate you all. Thank you.
And that's a wrap for Mary. Mary.
You're done.
Congratulations, Mary.
Yeah.
Yay, Mary.
All done.
Yay.
Do we have some pictures we could put up?
Ah,
Yeah,
There's
where's
some
that
pictures we
slide?
could put up.
Yeah, no pictures, not again. No. Unless you have the ones Chris wanted to send that she said weren't always the best.
Yeah,
There.
I'm looking forward to those. When do you think those will arrive?
I don't know. I'm afraid I don't even know what they are. All right,
That's
so
a good sign.
yeah, thanks everybody. I'm gonna
Yeah.
sign off.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Nice job, Mary.
Thanks, everybody.
Everybody.
Thanks, Mary. Thanks, everyone.